Cornell Republicans, and it is my honor to lead the organization this year. For almost as long as Cornell has stood on this hill, our organization has proudly promoted the values that make this country great. The mission of a university is forming its students, but so often liberal campuses like this one fail at this task. Students must be encouraged to grow. They must grow in charity for one another and grow in faith and hope of salvation. This especially requires growing in the love of God, especially on a campus where professing Jesus as King is edgy, unacceptable, and potentially career-ending. CRs exist to fill this gap, to share this vision of virtue with our members, and hopefully all of you here today. We bring speakers for this end, spreading the good news of virtue and charity. We are especially grateful to Young America's Foundation and our generous benefactor for sponsoring tonight's event as part of YAF's Things That Matter lecture series. We must also thank all of our donors who continuously support our work. Now, to introduce our speaker. Ben Shapiro is the co-founder of The Daily Wire and the host of The Ben Shapiro Show. In addition, he also hosts several other podcasts, including Debunked, Ben Shapiro's Book Club, The Search, and the very popular Sunday Special. But most importantly, he is the father of 4, and his wife is a doctor. Please join me in welcoming Ben Shapiro.
Thanks so much. That's really kind. Well, thank you so much. It is an honor and a pleasure to be at the school that has an agricultural component that can call Keith Olbermann an alum. Well, obviously, we have an election coming up in 1 week, and it's a pretty important election for a variety of reasons. I want to go through some of those reasons tonight. I think the most obvious reason why election 2024 is so important is because intersectional wokeness must die. It must die a painful death. Intersectionality, as it's come to be understood, is the basic theory that you can adjudicate whether somebody is a victim or whether somebody is a villain based on their group's level of relative success in American life or internationally. And this is a hideous ideology. Again, the basic assumption is that all disparities, any group disparity, is the result of discrimination. So if one group is underperforming economically, it must be that they've been victimized by the overarching system in some deep and abiding way. And if one group has succeeded, that means that they must be exploiters. And this narrative has driven so much of American politics over the course of the last 15 years in the United States. It's now been applied internationally. You can see how it's driven American politics. Kamala Harris, for example, when she first came into office, there was a report from the New York Times just this Friday suggesting that one of the first things she did is she looked at intelligence reports, and she doesn't like to read reports, as we know from other reporting. This is not her thing. She doesn't like to read the long reports, and so instead what she decided to spend her time doing was going through these intelligence reports for descriptions of female leaders of other countries looking for sexist language to extirpate from the intelligence reports. So it didn't matter what the intelligence report said, it mostly mattered whether they were using gendered terminology to refer to female leaders in other countries. So they did like a full study, they broke it down, and found actually the intelligence community, for all of its failings, this is one thing they actually weren't doing. They weren't using supremely gendered language with regard to female foreign leaders in other countries. That did not stop Kamala Harris from initiating an effort to educate all members of the intelligence community as to the preferred pronouns, presumably, of various leaders around the world. Kamala Harris, of course, is the same person who in the 2020 election cycle put out a ridiculous video suggesting that the goal of American life, and indeed all of civilization, should be that everyone end up in the same place. Not that everyone have equal rights or be treated as an individual. Her suggestion was that if the system did not guarantee equality of outcome, it wasn't truly equity. And equity is what we ought to seek, and that's why you see her during this campaign proclaiming that, for example, she will give away essentially $20,000 handouts to black men or to Latino men in pursuit of their votes in this election cycle, because these are presumably victimized groups. And the way you can tell that they're victimized is not by evidence of actual legal discrimination, which of course is illegal under the Civil Rights Act, and under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Instead, you can tell that they are victimized, again, via disparity. Now, this philosophy is truly ugly. You can see its ugliest manifestations internationally. This is the manifestation you see via, say, Ta-Nehisi Coates with regards to the Middle East. He takes this framework and then he applies it to Israel and the Palestinians. The idea being that because the Palestinians are less successful than the Israelis, it must be that the Israelis are the great exploiters and the Palestinians are the great exploited. This is, simply put, bullshit. The reason that one of these groups is more successful is because one of these groups has decided to apply concepts like property rights and democracy and freedom of speech and free markets to their actual body politic. And the other group has decided to elect a terrorist group in the Gaza Strip, a terrorist group that then proceeds to kill all of its political opponents and spend billions of dollars building a network of terror tunnels that is larger than the London Underground. Turns out that that is a pretty good explanation for why one group has economically failed and one group is more successful. That is not a story of exploitation. It turns out that in a free society and internationally, solid, good decision-making tends to result in success. When you have a zero-sum view as to success and failure in the world, you end up at the perverse result that the worse you are as a human being, the more violent you are as a human being, the more unsuccessful you are as a human being, the better you and more virtuous you are. And this ends with suppressing innovation. It ends with suppressing virtue. It ends with suppressing good decision-making. That ideology has to die. It also ends with suppressing truth, because one of the foundations of Western civilization and of biblical living is the basic idea that you are responsible for your actions, and if you act virtuously in the world, you will indeed live a better, more fruitful, and more successful life. If you deny that premise, then the result is you have to deny a basic truth. And instead, what you have to do is you have to suggest that the world owes you something. It's not that you owe it to yourself and to your family to make good, solid decisions that make your life and the life of those around you better. Instead, it's that the world owes you success. The world owes you a feeling of fulfillment. This is how you end up at the bizarre supposition that men can be women and women can be men. Because again, the idea here is that if I feel a thing on the inside of me, thus, the rest of the world has to legitimize that viewpoint no matter how stupid and how false that viewpoint is. Intersectional wokeness must die. Okay, reason number 2. The selection matters. Because it turns out that economic illiteracy is a very bad thing. Again, when we talk about zero-sum thinking of the economy in terms of zero-sum antics is ridiculous. It is false, it is untrue, and it is dangerous. Now, one of the great sort of ideas that has hit Western civilization, and indeed all of mankind, via bleed-down effect over the course of the last couple of centuries, is the free market. It's kind of amazing to consider the fact, when you think about it, that every material that Elon Musk is currently using in his rockets was available on planet Earth to the cavemen. There's literally nothing new under the sun. All the sand that is being used to make the microchips and superconductors that power your phone has been available since literally the beginnings of Earth. That's an amazing supposition. So what actually changed? What changed is innovation. What changed is property rights. What changed is the idea that if you make something, if you innovate, then you can actually keep the fruits of your labor, and then you can trade the fruits of your labor for somebody else's labor. And when you do that enough times, what you end up doing is benefiting everybody. I've said before that capitalism is a system of forced altruism, which of course it is, because in order for you to earn a living, you have to benefit somebody else, as opposed to socialism, which is simply selfishness. The idea that somebody else owes something to you by dint of you existing on the earth. Now, there are certain people in our society that we treat in a socialistic manner. I, for example, treat my children in a socialistic manner because they're not capable of earning a living. Not yet. They're getting older. I expect them to get out in the workforce right now. The oldest is 10. It's time for her to get a job. But the basic concept, which is that free trade, property rights, and innovation are what drive humanity forward, this idea is somehow fought by an enormous amount of our political class. I won't just relegate this to the left, by the way. There's some on the right who seem not to understand this either. There's some on the right who seem to believe that if there's an economically dispossessed segment of the population, that it must be that somebody else has exploited or victimized them in order to achieve that economic dispossession. That isn't true either. That's zero-sum thinking. The reality is the vast majority of the world's population has been raised from abject poverty over the course of the last 4 decades alone by property rights and innovation. Now, the way that you actually achieve prosperity is through incentivizing innovation. It's through incentivizing risk-taking. It's by rewarding, not punishing, not yelling at, not treating as the enemy people like Elon Musk. Elon Musk is generating things that are good. He is doing incredible things for humanity, whether you like his politics or whether you don't like his politics. By the way, I can say that about people I disagree with, too. I disagree with Jeff Bezos on politics. It turns out that Jeff Bezos' Amazon has done enormous good for the world. It has made the world an enormously better place, and we have all benefited from that. That is because of innovation. It's because of creativity. Any system that seeks to punish that or treat that as though somebody has done something wrong by creating a new good product or service is an idiotic system. So when Kamala Harris suggests, for example, that we ought to have a wealth tax in this country, the stupidest single economic idea I have ever heard, an unearned wealth tax, right? A tax on unearned capital gains, for example, a suggestion that she put out early on in the campaign. For those who don't understand how dumb that is, let me explain in very brief fashion how stupid this is. Okay, this is the idea that you buy a house. You buy the house for, hers would apply to people who make about, I think it's $100 million, but that takes out pretty much every mid-major business in the country. So let's talk about it on a personal level by analogy. If you were to buy a house for $250,000 and then not sell the house, okay, but it accrues in value over the course of years, you haven't sold it, remember, and now it is worth $1 million, and we are going to take a 50% wealth tax. You have not sold your house. The upside has been $750,000. You will now pay 50% on that. So more than the house you paid for, more than you paid for the house, you will now pay to the government for the privilege of not having sold the house. That's the idea of an unearned capital gain, a tax on unearned capital gains. It's absolute insanity, and it only comes from economic illiteracy. Unfortunately, economic illiteracy is completely widespread among the American population. People don't understand the difference between innovation, they don't understand investment, they don't understand the difference between a wage job and an ownership position where you actually absorb the risk. If you are accepting a wage for a job, you inherently are not accepting the risk of the job. You get the check in the mail every week so long as you're employed. If you are the person who started the business, if you don't make a profit that week, you don't get any profit. And if the business goes under, you absorb all of that risk. That is the reason we incentivize people to take the risks, because the person who does all the hiring is the person who takes that is a good thing. That is a positive thing for the world. Nothing annoys me more than the lack of gratitude among people who live in the richest time in literally human history, bitching about how hard they have it. It really is an amazing thing, truly. You know, Louis C.K., before his untimely demise in terms of career, but he remains the funniest comedian working, he has a whole routine where he talks about the fact that we sit around whining about conditions on airplanes. And it's like, people, you are on a box that flies in the sky across the world to places that it would have taken your ancestors literally years of their lives to get to, and you're complaining about the quality of the peanuts. Okay, the reality is that we live in the greatest of times because of that innovation. Anything that hampers that innovation is a bad thing. We ought to be rewarding and celebrating entrepreneurs. We all ought to be aspiring to be those people. Okay, the third reason this election matters is because obviously the world is on fire. The world is on fire from the border to the Middle East to Ukraine. It is on fire everywhere. And it turns out that it's on fire because when America shows weakness in the world, there is no substitute for America. America remains the indispensable power on planet Earth. Anybody who tells you otherwise is lying to you. There is no international rules-based system that is not backed by American force or the threat of American force. Anybody who pretends the UN has any sort of actual real power, that is insane. They clearly do not. In fact, UN agencies are far more likely to engage in hobnobbing with terrorists than they are to actually stop terrorism, as we have found out from UNIFIL in southern Lebanon or the UNRWA in the Gaza Strip. So, what exactly is this election about in foreign policy terms? Well, it is about just that. It's about the credible threat of American force. Should America be a force in the world? And for people who don't think this sort of thing matters, I would just, if you enjoyed the inflation of the last 2 years, get ready for massive inflation if America no longer controls the freedom of the seas. They're just unseen benefits that we all experience because of the fact that America is the global hegemon. That is an excellent and very good thing, that America is a global hegemon. And it turns out that you don't actually have to use force in all of these places. I think there's been a false binary that's been created by some on both the left and the right that suggests that the only way for America to be a credible power in the world is to randomly use force willy-nilly every which way. We have to just go to war everywhere. And that, of course, is not true. It turns out that when people don't know what you're going to do, that's actually also a pretty good way of doing foreign policy. So, yeah, I held a fundraiser for President Trump maybe 5 months ago. And President Trump, we had a bit of a tete-a-tete on the side of the fundraiser. And President Trump was saying, Ben, he goes, Ben, you want to know why Vladimir Putin never invaded Ukraine while I was president of the United States? You want to know? well, I called up Vlad, and I said, Vlad, don't you go into Ukraine. If you go into Ukraine, I'm going to bomb the shit out of you. And the story continues. This is the best part of the story. He goes, and then Vlad said to me, no, you won't, Mr. President. And I said, well, Vlad, I might. And then he turned and he said the moral of the story, which was pretty obvious, which is, if you think that the most powerful country in the history of planet Earth might bomb you, you don't do the thing. You know when you do the thing is when you have a president who says things like, stop and don't. In exactly the same sort of inflection that Willy Wonka uses, right as Augustus Gloop is sucked up into the chocolate pipe. Stop, don't, wait. It's a red line. Oh, it doesn't work. Well, there's unfortunately at least one party, and maybe a quarter of another party, that tend to believe that American weakness on the world stage somehow makes the world a safer place, and that is obviously untrue. It is not true in Ukraine. It is certainly not true in the Middle East, where President Trump was responsible for the most burgeoning peaceful era in Middle Eastern history, specifically because he was strong on foreign policy in the Middle East. It also happens not to be true on the border. It turns out that closing the border up isn't that hard a thing. In fact, if you don't believe me, you should ask Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, who apparently have done it in the course of the last 3 months by issuing a couple of executive orders. It turns out that when you want to do it, you can. But that's what this election is about. And finally, believe it or not, this election is about the preservation of institutions. This is the part where everybody starts going, whoa, hold on. Preservation of institutions, you're talking Trump and Harris and January 6th, the preservation of institutions. Okay, so let me talk about this election from a slightly different perspective. Okay, the way that I tend to think about who we vote for, I've given up on, the question of whether presidential candidates should be rich in character. This died, I think, long ago with Bill Clinton. It hasn't been a relevant consideration in American politics since JFK was schlepping interns in the swimming pool. But since this is now, sort of popped its way back up into American politics, here's how I think of my politicians. I do not see them as iconic heroes. I do not see them as great moral exemplars. I see them as plumbers. They are there to fix the toilet. And if they fix the toilet, that's pretty much the thing I care about. Don't care about much of the other stuff. You want to say what you want to say? Sure, it could be better. I would love if we didn't have the constant tweeting and the stream of bizarre jokes. That'd be great. But you know what I really care about? Whether the toilet is running or not. You can be as polite as you want to be. You can spew word salad all day. But if the toilet ain't fixed, I don't care and I don't want to hear it. So when I look at the wages of elections, the way I think of it is that constitutional government in America is like a giant strainer. And every candidate just tosses in a bunch of stuff into that strainer. And some of it's good, some of it's bad, some of it's bad ideas, some of it is, doing weird stuff between the November election and January. Some of it's all that stuff. And then you have the strainer, and the strainer is called the constitutional gridlock system, right? It is the checks and balances of the Constitution of the United States. It's the checks and balances between the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judiciary, and the balance between the states and the federal government and all of that. And the strainer tends to get rid of most of the bad stuff. It tends to strain that stuff out. But there's a kind of thing that the strainer is not built to do. And what the strainer is not built to do is sift out the extremely fine and meticulous attempts to edge around it. So in other words, very stupid blunderbuss attempts to break the strainer tend to fail. But the kind of stuff that tends to succeed is where, for example, you take over the administrative state and you fill it with people who agree with you. And then gradually, through regulatory overreach, you completely change the way the economy is done in the United States. Right? That the system is not really built for, because that's incremental and it's slow, and there's not really a great check or balance for that sort of thing. Which is why when I look at this election, yeah, sure, Donald Trump is going to say weird things. Donald Trump is going to every so often tweet something that mystifies my originalist conception of the Constitution. And then the wages of that will be nothing. And the reason I say the wages of that will be nothing is because we already had one term of Trump. So if he was going to be Hitler, it seems like he already should have done so at this point. And as a person who visited the grave of Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson on October 7th with Donald Trump, I can promise you he's doing Hitler real bad. What I am worried about in terms of our institutions is, for example, Kamala Harris's pledge to kill the filibuster, to get rid of the filibuster and thus to usher in, presumably, 2 new states into the Senate of the United States, attempting to permanently stack the Senate in favor of Democrats, to stack the Supreme Court or term limit the Supreme Court, to expand executive power willy-nilly. And these are things I'm worried about. I'm worried about the continued corruption of the legacy media under the auspices of a Democrat. And there's a story that we're going to be breaking a little bit later tonight over at Daily Wire. You can check my Twitter feed. It may go out right now, actually, but you'll see. About the predations of the legacy media that are truly astonishing, truly astonishing. And that sort of stuff must be stopped. Because under Joe Biden, they have felt their oats. You know, free speech applies, freedom of the press applies, and also liars should be exposed, and legacy media have gotten away with an awful lot of lies, including the lie, by the way, that Joe Biden is still alive somewhere. That one's weird to me. So, listen, for a lot of you, this might be the first presidential election that you've ever voted in, which is amazing. I remember when I was in your seat. It was long ago. And we had a different slate of candidates then. And my first election, let's see, would have been 2004. That was Bush and Kerry. So slightly different optics to the election. But it is a very important election, and the trajectory of where America goes is indeed reliant on how you vote and how you think, more importantly. Because even if you sit out this election, even if you believe this election isn't for you, you should recognize the trajectory that America is on. We are at an inflection point right now. We are either going to be a country that values things like innovation and virtue and hard work and individualism and free speech and, yes, the institutions of a functional government, or we're going to be a nation that doesn't value any of those things, and in which the federal government is seen as both the cure-all and as the chief weapon to use against your opposition. That's the choice before us. It's a really important choice. I hope you make the right one. Happy to take your questions.
We're now going to move into the Q&A section of the event. If you would like to ask a question, there's a line forming over with my colleague Nikolai over there. Please form in an orderly fashion.
I do have one rule, as always, which is that if you disagree with anything I've said or anything that I've said ever, actually, then raise your hand and you go to the front of the line because it's more fun.
All right, if you'd like to ask a question, please state your name and then ask a brief question.
Hello, my name is Jose Toledo, and I disagree because you created the Daily Wire, and obviously it's very, right-leaning, proposes that, and that's all right. However, it does seem to divide more than anything. So my question is more so, how would you see in the future a way to unite sort of both parties who disagree so much, to where the goal is to better the lives of anyone instead of one side winning over the other?
So I'm not sure that the goal should be that both parties eventually are the same. Right? I think it's very good that we have a robust debate in this country. And I think one of the problems with the current American body politic is that we're actually not having those debates. Instead, we're sort of screaming at each other. So actually today, I did a conversation with Sam Harris, who's a Kamala Harris voter, that should be out tomorrow on Barry Weiss's podcast. I actually try to facilitate these conversations. I think they're really, really important. And I think that is a good thing. So me and my publication being, openly conservative, I think is an aspect of honesty. We're not trying to hide the ball. We're not saying we're objective. We'll give you our perspective on the facts. And as I've said many times, if you want to know the difference between the facts and my opinion, what you should do is you should listen to my show and then you should listen to Pod Save America. This is something they'll never say about my show, by the way. You should listen to both of those shows, and then wherever there's crossover, that's probably the common locus of fact, and then everything else is opinion. So I think that you have to start with a common locus of fact, and then you actually have to have those conversations. The truth is, the problem with the body politic in America right now, I think, is less of a top-down problem and more of a bottom-up problem. The truth is that the way we used to experience life in the United States was as members of a community. I'm lucky. I live in a Jewish community. It's a very close-knit Jewish community, and that means that we share a common sense of purpose in our shul. We know each other. We know each other's kids. That sort of stuff is indispensable. As church has fallen away in American life, it's taken away the institutions that we used to actually form within, and that's been really a negative thing. So I think that forming those institutions again is good. I mean, college can be a place for that, for sure, but it actually has to require commonality of goal. One of those goals can include open political conversation.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. I'm actually one of those people who doesn't agree with you, but was a fan or am a fan.
Well, I appreciate you coming out. That's great.
Yeah, I have a question. You talked about the economic illiteracy of Kamala Harris's wealth tax, but Trump is currently proposing a 10% tariff on, or even more, on all goods from every country, meaning every producer in this country needs to pay 10% on everything that they make, and those costs will be passed on to consumers, as we know, inflation.
Yes.
So what do you think about economic illiteracy on the right, and shouldn't we just be just as concerned about that?
So excellent question, and yes. The answer is yes. Across-the-board tariffs are an incredibly bad economic idea. Obviously, that does amount to a blanket tax on Americans. Now, here's what I actually think President Trump is doing, and the reason I think, that I have to do a deep read of President Trump is because you always have to do a little bit of chicken entrail reading, depending on what Trump is saying at any given time. The way that I tend to read President Trump is by looking at what he did in his first term. I have a record. So the way that Trump uses tariffs is that he uses them as a threat mechanism for other countries in order to pry things out of them. So he used to do this with Justin Trudeau all the time. You'll recall that he actually did this with NAFTA. You remember he said he was going to get rid of NAFTA? And NAFTA is, of course, a free trade agreement with Canada, the United States, and Mexico. He said he was going to totally destroy it. And what did he do? He came and he basically negotiated a deal that was very similar to NAFTA, but more advantageous for the United States in a couple of ways. Now, I'll tell you what was mildly interesting is that actually over the last 48 hours, Trump said that he wants to do the blanket tariff, but he would do that as a replacement for the income tax. Now, that's kind of fascinating. Honestly, that one is actually kind of interesting to me because on the one hand, you are certainly increasing prices, but on the other hand, you get rid of the income tax, you're going to pretty dramatically lower prices in the United States. Plus, you're not going to be penalizing innovators who earn more. So, that one's it's not going to go anywhere, obviously, but that one's more interesting. So, if I thought that were the actual implementable policy that Donald Trump was going to pursue as president, I'd be more disquieted. Again, I think that Trump has ideas about tariffs that are just economically wrong, but I also think that is a stratagem that he frequently uses in order to sort of bluff and pressure people into doing things in much the same way he did this with NATO too. You remember he said, well, I don't like NATO, NATO's out. And then did we pull out of NATO? No, he used that as a weapon in order to get other members of NATO to increase their defense spending.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrew. I am also someone who tends to disagree with you, but this is a question that's more neutral in its content. In 2023,
I'll be the judge of that.
In 2023, the Surgeon General declared an epidemic of loneliness. Throughout the U.S., Americans are struggling with social disconnection as social infrastructure begins to fall apart, and we lose opportunities for us to connect. One particularly impacted area is rural communities. What do you think is the role of the government to help socially connect Americans in rural areas, and how can we rebuild the social and physical infrastructure of these areas while retaining the rural nature that so many people choose to live in?
This is such a great question, and it was neutral, so I appreciate that. That was well stated. So, when it comes to the building of social connection, I do not think government is capable of doing this. I think one of the great tragedies of government, particularly federal government, but it's true on the local level, is the substitution of government for church. So take the economic function of what a church used to be. So it used to be, and it still is in, again, close-knit communities like mine. Let's say somebody in our community loses a job. The first thing everybody does is they start a meal train, right? We immediately make sure that their family is taken care of. We make sure there's food on the table for their kids. And then we all immediately start searching our Rolodex to see if we can find somebody a job. And we do that because, again, we know each other. We know each other's kids. We all go to the same synagogue together. And this is true for churches across the country, right? And that can't be substituted for by government saying, we're going to have a job listing, or government saying, here's a welfare check. Because you're still disconnected from your community, and what's worse, you tend to then feel that you are entitled to something from the community around you. See, the thing about being a member of the synagogue community is you feel, if you're taking from your friends, you feel bad about that. If you're somebody who's receiving from your community, you feel grateful for it. You understand people are giving to you and going out of their way to make that happen. It's not some big disembodied thing that supposedly generates its own money supply. That's money that I could be using for my own family that I am giving to you. And what that generates is a feeling of duty in the recipient, as well as a feeling that the money isn't yours in the giver, right? That's the purpose of in Hebrew it's called tzedakah, but charity, just generally, that's the purpose of charity. The government tried to fulfill the economic function of church, and instead what it ended up doing was completely removing all of the social bonds that actually tie people together. This is true in so many areas of American life. So, I'm glad that there's a pension system in the United States, a government pension system. However, one of the costs of that government pension system, Social Security, is that kids no longer feel the obligation to take care of their parents. They feel that Social Security is going to take care of it for them. So they sort of shuttle mom and dad off to an old age home as opposed to what the proper function of grandma and grandpa was, which was to be in the home helping with the kids, being part of a broader kinship network. Right? So the solution to this cannot be the government coming in and signing a check. The Surgeon General declaring an epidemic of loneliness accomplishes absolutely nothing. You can declare an epidemic of everything. What you actually need is people re-engaging with true community, which is why I say that everybody should go back to church. Even if you're somebody who is struggling with God, doesn't necessarily believe in God, I would suggest that you find the utility of church. Maybe you find God through the utility of the church, but you need to find some social institution that exists outside of government. Because family is the original one. But whether it's family, whether it's church, there have to be little platoons, as Edmund Burke suggested, outside of government that build the social fabric. That can only be created bottom up. It can only be destroyed top down.
Cool. Thank you.
Hello, my name's also Ben. I'm from Pittsburgh as well. My question is sort of a follow-up on your takeoff foreign policy. You specifically said Donald Trump would be able to project American strength abroad. However, during his first term, he isolated our allies by imposing large tariffs on their commodity items and also disparaged our allies both when he was a president and now. Are you worried that these types of policies, would cause our adversaries to take our threats less seriously? And you think it would cause our allies to feel that we are not a trustworthy partner and would make more deals with our adversaries?
So, again, I disagree with a lot of your characterization of what President Trump did while he was president. Obviously, he was not fond of Justin Trudeau. The feeling was absolutely mutual. It turns out that Bernie Sanders' handsome cousin is not a very good prime minister of Canada. In any case, the sort of disagreements that you have among Western countries are as nothing compared to the disagreements that obviously exist between Western countries and, say, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. President Trump, he says stuff on Twitter all the time, but then it turns out that when it comes time to put the pedal to the metal and actually face down President Trump, all of these dictators were significantly less likely to do so with Trump than they were with either Barack Obama or with Joe Biden before and after Trump. And you have to ask yourself why. The reason for that is, number one, Donald Trump is very unpredictable. But number two, if you are an ally of the United States, say, let's just take the Middle East because that's an area where the biggest conflagration has happened. It's either Ukraine or the Middle East. Those are really the two big examples of conflagrations, although, again, I could point out that if we're talking about betraying allies, there was no worse betrayal of an ally than what Joe Biden did to our Afghan allies in 2021. It was the worst betrayal of an ally in American history. We walked out on a group of people who had risked their lives in order to ally with the United States. They then stuffed 19 million women back into burqas or into the basement so that sixth grade girls would be forcibly married and couldn't get an education. We left billions of dollars in military equipment. People were falling off wheel wells. And Afghan interpreters who had worked with the American military were being slaughtered in the streets by the Taliban. So if we're talking about betrayal of allies, that seems high on the list. Other things that seem high on the list would be the distancing of the United States from Saudi Arabia, from Israel in the early days of the Biden administration. The truth is, it has been much easier to be an American adversary over the course of the Biden administration than it ever was under Trump. And even if you believe that it's just the crazy man theory, that you never know when the crazy man's going to go crazy, even if that's your theory, that's still better than the predictable weakness we've gotten from Biden and would get from Kamala Harris.
Right, thank you.
First, thank you for coming to Middle of the Nowhere Ithaca to speak to us. We really appreciate it. So, you've written about your commitment to improving political discourse in places across the country, especially left-leaning university like ours here today. So, despite that, you've still modeled a fairly combative rhetoric when doing, for example, your takedown videos, which, while entertaining, don't really change that many minds. So I wanted to ask, how does this align with what you hope to teach future generations?
So, I think that, number one, the labeling on a YouTube video and the content of a YouTube video sometimes are two very different things. So if you actually watch the takedown videos or the Ben Shapiro destroys videos, very often, which I will freely admit are titled in such a way as to gain viewership, right? I mean, that's just the way that you get things clicked on the internet, and I'm not going to apologize for the business being the business. I didn't make the rules. We're just really good at the game. But with that said, most of the conversations that I have with students on campus go very much like the one that you and I are having right now. They tend to be actually pretty cordial. I don't know how many of you saw that debate that I did with 25 Kamala Harris supporters, the Jubilee debate last week. So I would suggest that I wasn't just cordial. I bent over backwards to be extremely cordial during that interview as I was being berated by a rather large person for minutes on end. And so, you know, The same thing is true when I went to Oxford University and I was debating students with regard to the Israel-Gaza issues. Now, I really try to have, I think, honest conversations with people as opposed to, for example, calling them names. That's actually not something that I do in any of the Ben Shapiro Destroys videos. You won't see any of them where I just start calling somebody a name. I don't do that. It's not my thing. I'll make jokes about people on my show because it's an entertaining show. But when I'm doing an exchange with somebody, that's typically not how it goes. So I would urge people to, click on the link and then actually watch the video. Because if you watch the video, what you'll notice is that about 98% of the time it's a pretty cordial and nice exchange.
Thank you.
Hey, Ben. My name's Frank. So as of today, The Economist presidential prediction model and many other, like 538 polling, placed Trump about 1% above Kamala Harris. We saw in like 2016 and 2020 how, typically the Democratic candidates are overpolled by about 5%, and then it turns out Trump actually comes in much closer. Do you think that this election cycle, pollsters are trying to overcompensate for this, or do you think he actually is ahead?
This is the biggest question, right? It's chicken entrails. So I've spoken with Nate Silver about this, who I think is the best poll analyst in the country, bar none, and Nate is not sure. Meaning everybody's trying to read tea leaves. One of the big problems in modeling an electorate where Donald Trump is on the ballot is it's almost impossible. Right? He draws people who are low propensity voters, and high propensity voters always vote, but do you use a high propensity model? Do you use a low propensity? Like, even if you use the two examples where Trump was on the ballot, 2016 and 2020, super disparate elections, right? 2016, very low turnout election. 2020, the highest turnout election by far in American history. Increase of 22 million voters in one election cycle. So I think this election cycle is more likely to look like 2020 or 2016. I think it's going to look more like 2016. I think that you're going to see a depressed vote from 2020. Because in 2020, everybody was stuck inside for the pandemic, and because there was such heavy focus because of BLM and the COVID insanity, I think that you're likely to see a reversion to something that looks like the mean here. It's very difficult to tell. I think anybody on the right who's telling you it's a shoo-in, Trump's definitely going to win, they're fibbing. And anybody who tells you that it's a shoo-in, Kamala is totally going to win, they're also fibbing. I have no idea. Nobody has any idea. It's a 50-50 toss-up race. I can give you my gut feeling. My gut feeling is that Trump has the momentum right now. And that gut feeling is based on a little bit of polling data that suggests that the races have gotten significantly closer also in the Senate, but also that's based on Kamala Harris's behavior. Right? She seems to be acting out of desperation now. When you're relegated in the last week of the campaign to basically saying that your opponent is Adolf Hitler, that's usually not a particularly good indicator that you're doing well in the campaign. Especially because she came into the campaign basically saying she wasn't going to do that, right? That was Joe Biden's pitch. Joe Biden was that Trump was orange Hitler with two mustaches, and that failed, obviously, and so she kind of went in the joy direction, and then it turns out that the joy machine started to run out of fuel about 7 weeks in. And ever since then, it's just been depression and Tim Walz making weird hand motions.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kenneth. I'm from Miami, Florida. If you consider the southern border a crisis, which I'm sure you do, why are you not infuriated when Trump effectively coerced the Republicans in Congress to shoot down the border bill that would have capped the flow of asylum seekers to a running average of 5,000 a day? Why is this not a slap in the face to the people in border states who want permanent action by Congress and not temporary fixes through executive actions?
Okay, because the border bill did a few things. It's a great question. So it has been the talking point of the Harris campaign with regard to the border, right? Is there would have been a closed border if only we'd done the border bill, which ignores the fact that the border bill was brought up, I believe, in 2023, and there were 2.5 years of Biden's open border before that. But we can put that aside. The Lankford bill, right? And I'll call it the Lankford bill because he was really the big Republican co-sponsor on that. There are significant problems with that bill, including what you say, which was the automatic executive kick-in as to executive action taken on the border, kicked in at like 4,000 to 5,000 border encounters a day. That's a very, very high number where the automatic presidential kick-in happens. Meaning that there are a lot of people who are like, why exactly is that the floor? Why is the floor that level of illegal immigration where you're having this many border encounters a day? Really, the level should be zero. It should be very, very close to zero. And is executive action enough to do that? Or are you really, when you say bipartisan bill, you have to acknowledge that there were things Democrats wanted in there too. Like, for example, there was a lot more funding for a lot of these sort of facilitative methods of getting people into the country very, very quickly. They wanted to process people, put them in the country faster. It wasn't just about screening them better. It was about processing them and getting them in faster. Listen, I've been down to the border. The system is obviously broken. Everybody acknowledges that the system is broken. There are a few quick fixes that you can make with regard to at least stopping the traffic on the border, and Trump had largely implemented those. Remain in Mexico and revising the asylum standards would have been big ones. Also, you're going to at some point have to overrule the Flores settlement and start deporting entire families. Right? Something Tom Homan, the former Border Patrol chief, said, that when you have family separation policies, which nobody loves, One of the big problems is you have a family that arrives. The Florida settlement suggests that kids can't be held in custody, so you release them to an adult custodian, and then you release the parents in order to be with the kid, and now you have an entire family of illegal immigrants who have crossed the border. That's not a way to handle a border under any. So let's put this. There were substantive concerns. Do I think that Donald Trump read the bill and agreed with all those substantive concerns? I don't think Donald Trump reads bills any more than I think Kamala Harris reads bills, any more than I think Congress reads bills. I don't think any of these people read the bills. Have you seen the bills? They're 1,000 pages long. I mean, nobody is reading these things. The lobbyists and the staffers are reading these bills. With that said, are there substantive reasons why that deal was not ideal and Trump perhaps thought that with a Republican Congress he could do better? Sure.
Thank you very much.
So hi, my name is Kurtanu. So previously in this talk, you've mentioned how wokeness sort of manifests itself as disparity being remediated by handouts. You've also in other media have said that DEI is response to disparity. So wouldn't you say, wouldn't how Trump being elected in 2016 sort of be adjacent or another form of this DEI as states with disparity are being given handouts, i.e. more representation per capita,
Right, so this is an argument made in that Jubilee video by one of the other people, right? So one of the other people suggested that essentially the Electoral College of the United States Senate was a form of DEI, which to me is a very bad category error. Okay, what the Constitution of the United States was a bargain between sovereign bodies. Okay, the way the Constitution was created was not just a bunch of people got together in a room. These were representatives of their sovereign states. These representatives of their sovereign states had to represent the interests of their sovereign states. There would be no United States without those sorts of compromises. So that exists. I'm not sure what the hell that has to do with grouping people by race, for example, across state lines. Races are not sovereign bodies in the United States, nor should they be. I would hope they never are. You don't have like the race of black people who now have their interests and then the race of white people who have their interests. We've had that in the past, actually, from white people toward black people, and it was really quite terrible in the Jim Crow South. So I'd hope that we never go back to anything like that. Likening that to sovereign states that were created originally by British charter and then got together in it's called the United States because they were states and then they were united. And so making a deal in which those states become united by bargaining is the nature of making any sort of governmental bargain. That has nothing to do with DEI. That has to do with a negotiated bargain between sovereign bodies.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anna. I fundamentally disagree with most of your opinions and beliefs.
Thank you for coming anyway. I appreciate it.
Thank you. My question is, you've built so much of your platform in the Daily Wire's platform on arguing that woke liberal agenda is threatening free speech, yet your own party's platform relies on white evangelical Christians who like to ban children's books such as Harry Potter, or books like The Bluest Eye written by Cornell's own alumni Toni Morrison. How do you reconcile censorship within your own party and your own claims that you support free speech so fully, or are you just arguing against ideas that you disagree with?
Okay, so I will leave aside my critiques that I won't leave it aside. Toni Morrison's one of the most overrated authors of our time, but
I don't know if I think that means she needs to be banned, though.
It's irrelevant to the conversation. I just couldn't resist. I have a long-standing dislike for Toni Morrison's work, but that's a different thing. If the question is about censorship, what you are referring to, typically speaking, is what we allow children to see. Free speech rules do not apply across the board with regard to children. Okay, there's no state in the union that, for example, bans you from buying a book from Amazon from Toni Morrison. It doesn't exist. Okay, I live in Florida, which is supposed to be like case 1A of censorship. I can get any book I want. I can say gay all the time there. It's actually fine. It's totally fine. I live there. It's fine. It happens all the time. What is actually happening is that when you have a school library, local people who go to the school and the school board set the standards as for what they wish to allow their children to see in the library. That seems perfectly appropriate to me. That is not a violation of free speech any more than it would be a violation of free speech to suggest that, for example, a 6th grade library not include Playboy or not include Larry Flint. Okay,
what about Harry Potter?
What about Harry Potter? Meaning that if you want to
evangelicals ban Harry Potter.
If you want to send your kid to a school that allows Harry Potter in the library, by all means do so. My kid's school does include Harry Potter in the library. It's a free country. That is not the same thing as banning Harry Potter. Banning Harry Potter would be to say that you cannot, under penalty of law, you cannot disseminate Harry Potter in, say, the state of Alabama. And if you sell it in the state of Alabama, they will prosecute you and put you in jail. It is a dramatic misnomer to suggest that, and I like when people use Harry Potter as the example because, honestly, like name the list of schools that are banning Harry Potter. I can name you a list of schools that is much, much longer that's banning, say, genderqueer for fourth graders, which seems totally appropriate to me. I think that risque sexual content that countenances a wide variety of sexual mores is not appropriate for fourth graders, and I don't see what's even remotely arguable about that.
I still think there's something to be said about don't say gay policies in public schools in Florida or book banning of children's books in public schools. I'm not saying Harry Potter was banned nationally.
It's not banned in Florida either. But
I don't think Harry Potter's banned by any state legislature. That's not what I was implying whatsoever.
A state legislature does have the ability, the right, and I would say the duty to prevent the dissemination of sexual material to kids K through 8 at a minimum. I would suggest that there's actually both a right and a duty for the state legislature to ban the dissemination of that material in schools completely, because it seems to me that that is totally appropriate for parents and community members to discuss with their kids, not for taxpayer-sponsored apparatchiks of the NEA to leverage their morality on kids. And if the state agrees with me, they should vote that way. And that is not a violation of free speech. We set standards every single day as to what kids should and should not learn in schools. For example, I would imagine that you, for example, would not be a fan if a state decided that you had to, for example, teach creationism in the classroom. You would not be a fan of that. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so you don't want that. Isn't that censorship of creationism? The answer is it's not censorship of creationism. School boards get to make these decisions because you always have a scarcity of time and a scarcity of material you can teach kids.
But creationism would be being taught as science. I'm talking about fictional children's literature.
Well, I think it's a fiction when you say that boys are girls and girls are boys.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro.
My name's Quinn Reinhardt. I'm from Long Island, New York. Ben, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's an absolute honor to have you on our campus. So my question for you, thank you. All right, limited time. I'm a proud gay Republican voting for Donald Trump again this election, but many in the LGBT... Thank you. First time wearing this hat in campus in public, but...
Has it been fun for you?
Many in the LGBT community feel that the liberal media has created a climate of fear centering former President Trump and the GOP. What message do you have for these individuals, particularly those that are undecided, to address their concerns and potentially change their perspectives?
Okay, so first of all, I think that the thing to understand about Donald Trump is Donald Trump has moved the Republican Party further to the moderate center or to the left on LGBT issues than any Republican in the history of the party. This is not debatable. I mean, he literally took gay marriage out of the platform for the RNC, right? I mean, that remains a very strong belief for many of us, including me, by the way, right? I'm a fan of traditional marriage. I should clarify, I don't mean that you shouldn't be able to do what you want in your private life or have the private arrangement you want. I'm talking about taxpayer-funded arrangements and what exactly the taxpayer's interest is in human coupling and the production of children, for example, which is what I think the taxpayer benefits are really for when you're talking about marriage. And I don't care about two people's love life. I care much more about the rewards or the penalties that we get for having kids. That said, I think that the sort of scaremongering about Trump on this issue is so bizarre. Like, what is the evidence that Donald Trump is some sort of insane theocrat whose handmaid's tale coming in and banning gay people from getting together or getting married or anything remotely like that? First of all, Obergefell is going unchallenged. Right? Obergefell is not getting overturned. That's the reality. It's the law of the land. I may disagree with Obergefell. I think it's a terrible Supreme Court decision. It's the law of the land anyway. Doesn't matter. Okay, so with that said, the supposed dire threat that Donald Trump of all humans poses to gay America, that's like one of the dumbest things ever. I at least sort of see the bizarre argument that you can make about a traditional conservative on these issues. Donald Trump isn't even a traditional conservative on these issues. So to make that argument about Trump is a massive stretch beyond all recognition.
Thank you so much.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Bruce. I've actually been watching your videos for a long time, since I was about 10 years old, so it's kind of surreal kind of standing here. But anyways, I'm going to try to make this quick because I know we have a long line of people. So a lot of the videos I initially watched of you back in like 2016, 2017, you gained a platform off of talking about what you call transgenderism. And many of these, you and your right-wing counterparts talk about it as a very serious national issue. So my question for you today is basically, what is the end goal in talking about it? Do you think that there is something to be done about it? And do you propose a quote unquote, I don't know, solution to transgenderism? And my follow-up question is, what makes my right to exist any less valuable than yours?
Okay, so whenever people say right to exist, I'm not trying to stifle your existence as a human, but I can disagree with your opinion about yourself, for example. Right? If you characterize yourself in a way I disagree with, I have every right to say that I disagree with that characterization, particularly if it's at odds with the actual definition of words or biology. Okay, so that is not a denial of somebody's right to exist. It's a denial that what they're saying about themselves is true, which we do to people literally all the time. Okay, so when it comes to, the importance of the issue, so is there a solution to transgenderism? No. If there's a solution to gender dysphoria, I would love to hear about it. Right? The gender dysphoria is the condition in the DSM-5 that characterizes transgenderism, right? People believing that they're members of the opposite sex. Discomfort in their own body that leads to depression, and suicidal ideation is sort of the definition in the DSM-5 to take a sort of broad-based view of what that is. Do I have a solution to that? No, I'm not a psychologist nor am I a scientist. What I know is not a solution to that is pretending things that are not true. Okay, there is no other condition in which we do this. None. Where we simply say that your perspective about yourself, even if it is at odds with the actual reality, ought to be humored and treated as true by the rest of society. I'm unaware of any other condition that is remotely like this. It does not exist. And the idea that we have to, as a society, redefine the categories of male and female to fit people who believe that they are a member of the opposite sex, that is an assault on truth. How people choose to live their lives as adults, I may have personal disagreements with those things. I have lots of opinions about lots of things, as it turns out. But when it comes to when it comes to things that we share, like the basis of language or the definition of words, that's stuff that really does have significant ramifications. And then, of course, you can talk about the ramifications for children. There's an article in the New York Times just last week talking about the massive cover-up that's been done in terms of studies on care for gender dysphoric youth with regard to, say, surgeries and hormones, which demonstrates pretty much no actual effect on suicidal ideation among gender dysphoric youth using these sorts of techniques. And that's been silenced by a lot of the scientific community. That is a real problem, and it does have real consequences for real kids. So that's the reason why it gets discussed a lot. But as far as people living disparate lives in the United States of America, I'm not sure that anybody has a problem with that. And if they do, I'm confused as to why, other than just, a general objection to, again, I have lots of I'm a religious person. I have objections to people who are of my religion eating pork, right? Those sorts of opinions exist all across the spectrum. I can think that I know what makes a happy life and, what sort of institutions foster that happy life. But the thing that I am concerned about when we get to the issue of transgenderism is the attempt to forcibly cause people to tell a lie about reality. And I don't mean the people who are gender dysphoric. I mean the attempt to make everybody else complicit in that lie, supposedly in the name of empathy, when in reality, I don't think that's empathy at all. I think that that's actually something quite terrible.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Hey, Ben, I first want to thank you for coming here to Cornell. I'm Danielle, and I think I can speak in behalf of many Cornell students. We appreciate the introduction of intellectual diversity here. My question is on the Daily Wiring firing situation early this year with Candace Owens. Given the whole situation and the central focus on free speech in this election, if you would have went back, would you have done anything differently?
No. So when it comes to, So let me explain. We are a publisher. We are not a platform. That means that there is a panoply of views that exist inside of our publishing house that we are willing to pay for, subsidize, sponsor, and purvey. And then there's a panoply of views that we clearly are not. To take another example, if we were to have a host who were to come out and simply say that abortion is an active good, right? It's an actively good, abortion is a wonderful, great thing. That person would not last long on our publishing platform, nor should they. That is not our job. Now, I've not called for anybody who's previously worked at our company to be banned from social media. These people continue to make a very solid living saying things with which I heartily disagree and think are very often not just factually incorrect, but morally specious. that I'm not calling for anybody to be banned. There are people who have physically threatened me who have not called for to be banned. That is a different thing than me paying those people to do the thing. Okay? And so if people act outside the standards of the Daily Wire, we are within our rights, and we reserve the right to say, well, no, that is not a thing that we wish to pay for.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Ben.
Hi, Ben. My name is April. I'm from Toledo, Ohio. Thank you for coming. You claimed to be a libertarian in the past. For example, on Joe Rogan, I believe you said that your views have shifted libertarian. So I was wondering if that also applied to stuff like gay marriage and like trans people's rights to freely exist, stuff like that.
Okay, so again, I will separate those two things. I'm not sure they're quite the same thing. When you say trans people's right to freely exist, again, I object to that sort of language. You have the right to exist in the world. That doesn't mean that you have the right to dictate everyone else's behavior to you any more than I have the right to dictate anyone else's behavior to me. That's not the way that it works. In a society, we have to have common rules of the road. Those are going to get decided in somebody's favor, and every rule affects people disparately. That's just the way that it works. As far as my own libertarianism, I will say that I'm more libertarian on a national level and significantly less libertarian on a local level. So I believe in the principle of subsidiarity. Okay, in a very diverse country like the one that we have with 340 million people, people in San Francisco are not going to choose to live like people in my area of South Florida or people in Alabama. And I think that if we wish to share a country, we just have to acknowledge that reality. If I were a dictator, would I do things differently? I'm not sure that I think there's a reason that being a dictator is actually quite a bad governmental system. I don't think that you can hold together a body politic that is diverse by basically cramming down one set of rules from above, which is why I'm a big believer in federalism and localism. So, for example, when it comes to weed, on a federal level, am I all that interested in the federal government and its policing of marijuana? Not particularly. Do I want my local community legalizing pot? No. Do I want the state of Florida legalizing pot? No. Do I think the federal government should be involved in that? Also, not really. Because I think that as you abstract up the chain, you're encompassing a more and more diverse group of people with a more and more diverse set of views. So I would say that I'm governmentally quite libertarian when it comes to sort of what the federal government's role is, as were the founders. When it comes to my local government, when it comes to the places where I live, I'm significantly less libertarian because that's the environment in which I raise my children.
Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, Ben. I'm Alex. Thank you for coming here. I think with the election coming up, the people need to know, should people who identify as they, them be able to vote multiple times?
No, only dead Democrats should be able to vote multiple times.
I have to say I disagree. I think dead Republicans should be able to vote too. Thank you.
Hi, Ben. I'm Asher. Welcome to Cornell. My question is, on the Republican Party, there seems to be a rift on whether America should be an interventionist state or an isolationist state. You kind of spoke about this briefly. What do you think the starting original concept of the isolationist argument was, and how do you deconstruct that?
Okay, so I think that there is a long history inside the Republican Party of this exact debate. If you go back to the 1930s, 1940s, inside the Republican Party, there was a big debate between more interventionist Republicans and people who were more isolationist, and that, of course, has remained the case all the way through the history of the Republican Party, all the way down to, say, George H.W. Bush and Pat Buchanan in 1992. I mean, these sorts of battles have always existed inside the Republican Party. And I think that one battle that is worth always having discussions about is less about the broad-based ideology and more about the proper application and use of force. So there's a broader ideological battle as to whether you think America is a good force in the world or whether it is a bad force in the world. There is one wing of the Republican Party that seems to have taken up the view that America is a nefarious force in the world, and that wherever America spreads power, things get worse. That sort of horseshoes around to meet Noam Chomsky on the far left, and I find that to be factually wrong and also morally idiotic. Then there is the sort of isolationist argument, which is that if you engage in too many wars, and by too many wars I mean nearly any wars, then that is going to weaken America internally, and so what we should do is sort of retreat to Fortress America. I think that is factually, I understand the argument, I think it's factually untrue, because I think that when you retreat from the world, it turns out the rest of the world tends to come in and fill the gap, and usually it's people you don't like very much. I mentioned freedom of the seas. If the United States Navy were to stop policing, for example, the South China Sea, or say the Straits of Malacca, then very quickly adversaries of the United States would come to control those things, and that would be very bad for the United States and our allies around the world. And then there's the sort of actual conversation that I think sometimes there's a mask for what the actual conversation is, which is, should we get involved in conflict X? Right? And that one, there are always good arguments on both sides. So, I've been labeled an interventionist. I was against intervention in Libya, for example.
Yeah, okay.
Right? Like, I can name a handful of conflicts that have been engaged in. Should we have gotten heavily involved in Syria? My opinion is no, but once you set a red line for the Russians, you kind of have to uphold the red line. There are a lot of kind of variables in terms of should you get engaged in a particular conflict. But the thing that I'm afraid of, on the right and the left, is this burgeoning isolationism that's rooted in an anti-American view of the world, which is that America and that basically everything bad that happens in the world is a result of blowback to America's overreach and interventionism. And I think that is a stupid point of view because it assumes that the only people on earth who have agency are the Americans. So when something bad happens, they'll say, well, it's because America did X. Right? It's because America did this and got involved here. That's why this happened. Or maybe there are other people on earth who have different interests than ours, and those are in constant conflict. And sometimes you need to check those other interests.
Thank you. Also, Marv's at 8:30.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As a Jewish prayer reference. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much, Ben, for coming to Cornell. My question revolves around wealth redistribution. You often argue against wealth redistribution and higher taxes on the wealthy. However, in the past 50 years, the wealth gap between the working class and the upper class has been growing by almost 10%, with single women, Africans, and Latinos being lower on the economic ladder, oftentimes, which you have said, are the people playing the victimization card. With these inequalities continue to grow, how can you not argue for some sort of wealth redistribution or taxes on the wealthy?
Okay, so there's a few points you made here. One is that when you talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, these are not stable groups of people. Okay, people go from the bottom quintile to the top quintile and back down to the second quintile and back up and back down. Okay, I in my life have been in probably the second to bottom quintile when I was growing up, and now I'm in the top quintile. Right? That's fairly common. This happens actually over the course of life for many people who just age in the United States. As you get older, you start to build wealth. Hopefully you get a job, and then you grow out of that. And the reality is that if you want to escape permanent poverty in the United States, you really only need to do three things. As I've discussed before, this is not my research. This is research from writers for The Atlantic, the Thurnstroms back in the 1980s, but it's been very well verified. You don't want to be in permanent poverty in the United States. Finish high school, get a job, don't have babies until you're married. Those three things, you won't be in permanent poverty in the United States. There is income mobility in the United States. That's number one. So when we say gap between the rich and the poor, you have to understand these are not stable groups of people. People are moving up and down between various wealth brackets. Point number two, the only way to solve the disparity in wealth, which sometimes is historic, meaning like your grandma had a house and now she passed it on to you. I will point out here, the vast majority of people who are very wealthy in the United States are not wealthy because grandma had wealth. Right? Elon Musk actually, contrary to popular opinion, did not grow up wealthy. Right? I did not grow up wealthy. In fact, most of the people that I know who are very, very wealthy did not grow up wealthy. There's tremendous income mobility. The way that you solve for wealth gaps in the United States is with better income mobility, and that only comes with an opportunity economy that allows people to move forward based on their efforts, right? Based on innovation, based on keeping the wealth that they generate in and of themselves. If you take that away from them, then it removes the incentive, and it also perverts the incentive structure. So there's that as well. And then finally, the biggest question of all is everyone, who talks about wealth redistribution, they like to talk about the wealth gap. Hey, I don't care about the wealth gap. I honestly don't. All I care about is the people at the bottom and are they getting better. I don't care if the person at the top is earning 100 times more than the person at the bottom. I just care whether the person at the bottom has a better life than they did 20 years ago. And it is bewildering to me that people are so concerned about what the guy next door is doing. Right? That just seems to me Cain and Abel jealousy. I've never thought to myself, man, my life is way better than it was when I was a kid, which it is, economically speaking. But you know who's way richer than I am? Elon Musk. And that's not fair. Right? That's a silly way to think about life. The question is whether all ships are rising. And for all of the talk about the middle class having stagnated in the United States, that is manifestly untrue. It is simply not true. And you can look in your pocket right now and you know it's not true. Okay, the device that you have in your pocket is a magical device that no one on earth had 50 years ago. It did not exist, and then only the rich people had back in the 1980s when Gordon Gekko was carrying around a shoebox on his head in Wall Street. And now we all have in our pocket more computing power than all of NASA had when we sent a man to the moon. Right? That is because everybody has gotten wealthier through innovation. They start off as a luxury item, and then they become a common everyday necessity. Right? Who would have called a cell phone in 1981 a necessity? But today you'd call a cell phone a necessity. We would all call a cell phone a necessity, and everyone in the United States who is deemed poor basically has a cell phone. Okay, that is because everybody has gotten a lot better. Final point on this. when you look at the wealth redistribution in the United States, the truth is the United States has an extraordinary amount of wealth redistribution. Very often when people talk about the income gap or the wealth gap in the United States, they're ignoring the benefits that are actually paid out from the top quintile on down. If you look at net benefits in the United States, if you look at net taxes in the United States, net taxes in the United States are not paid partially by the top quintile. They're paid entirely by the top quintile. Everybody who's below the top quintile is receiving more back in taxpayer subsidies and taxpayer dollars than they are paying in. So the United States has one of the most progressive income tax systems on the planet. In fact, if you actually wanted to have a more socialistic style welfare system in the United States, what you'd have to do is tax people at the bottom. Right? The top tax bracket kicks in places like Denmark and Norway at $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year, not at $300,000, $400,000 a year.
Thank you.
This next question will be our last question.
Hi, Ben. My name's Andrew. Thank you for coming. I just had a quick question. You mentioned that Ukraine seemed to allude to the fact that under Trump, Putin would not have been invaded, or seemed to suggest that at least. Can you tell me then exactly why Putin and the Kremlin are explicitly supporting Trump, why Trump has spoken to Putin 7 times since after leaving office, why he chose a running mate that says that he doesn't care about Ukraine, why he refused to support Ukraine during the debate, and why he keeps praising Putin over and over again? You're right that I agree with the fact that you said that he is less stable, but why is he so stable on this specific issue and seems to be stable in the wrong direction?
Right. Okay. So it's a good, solid question. So I will distinguish between the positions of J.D. Vance and President Trump on this particular issue. So Trump has been asked multiple times whether he would say withdraw full aid from Ukraine. You notice he's always demurred on that question. He's never answered that question straight because the answer is I don't think he would. I think that there's one thing that Donald Trump really, really doesn't like, and that's losing. It's like the number one thing he hates, as we can all attest, right? He doesn't like losing and doesn't like to admit it when he has. So he's not big into this. He doesn't want Vladimir Putin walking into Kyiv on his watch. I think the most likely outcome of President Trump becoming president is continued U.S. aid to Ukraine sufficient to solidify the borders around Donbass and the Crimea, because he doesn't believe that Ukraine is capable of winning back Donbass or Crimea, which, by the way, I think is probably likely given the state of play in Ukraine right now. And I totally understand why Ukrainians wouldn't feel that way. I understand why Vladimir Zelensky has an interest in trying to liberate Donbass and Crimea. Obviously, that's Ukrainian territory. That doesn't change the facts on the ground, which is that it's very unlikely that that's going to happen in the near term or in the far term. I mean, the Biden administration has basically acknowledged as much. You know, as far as, you know, the stuff that JD has said, obviously I disagree with JD. And again, you'll notice that JD has sort of moderated his position on this specifically because Trump does not agree with him, at least publicly facing, with regard to Ukraine funding. I don't, as far as Trump saying nice things about dictators, Trump says nice things about anybody who says nice things about him. You may have noticed this is a pattern, right? I mean, like, literally anybody, right? But that doesn't change the sort of underlying facts. So one day I'll be like, I have a love letter here from Kim Jong-un, and we're best friends. And then the next day he's like, I'm going to bomb the shit out of that guy. I've got a big button right here. And so you know what? I think one of the things that I've learned about President Trump over the course of my Trump journey, and we've all had our Trump journey, right? You know, President Trump has been the center of American politics, the lodestar of American politics for about a decade at this point. In 2016, I didn't vote for either candidate. In 2020, I voted for Donald Trump. In 2024, I fundraised for Donald Trump. And the reason for that is because in 2015, 2016, all I had to go on was the stuff he was saying. And since he was president, I can go on what he actually did. And what he actually did on foreign policy was, in fact, after all of the manipulations and all the twists and turns, fund our allies, support them, and deter America's enemies from egregious action.
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask a super quick follow-up, but you just mentioned that the most likely outcome is that he cuts basically or tries to end the war where it is now. That would in effect be giving Putin the outcome that he wants, not stopping Putin's aggression or cutting back on it at all, so, and rewarding that.
So I sort of take the Henry Kissinger position on this, which he was taking very early on, which was that it is, again, there are military realities on the ground. The military reality on the ground is that Ukraine is not in a military position, nor would it be, even with significantly more American aid, to push Russia fully out of Donbass and Crimea, both of which, by the way, are areas that are significantly more sympathetic to Russia than much of the rest of Ukraine. You know, I mean, there were referenda in those areas earlier than the invasion that seemed to be, you know, in favor of parties that seemed to be more pro-Russia than pro-EU, for example. Those areas are very difficult to liberate. Everybody acknowledges at this point, including the current White House, which I think everyone acknowledges is very pro-Ukraine, that those areas are likely not going to be liberated in the near future. And with that said, quote-unquote, rewarding Vladimir Putin, I don't really consider it a reward for Vladimir Putin to control the same territory that he controlled before he started the invasion, except at the cost of 500,000 Russian dead.
That's all we have time for tonight.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Great to see you.